Howard, do you want to tell us how you got involved in rock and roll?
Strange story. Both my father and grandfather were promoters in Melbourne that ran venues and did a lot of things, nightclubs, brought people out from overseas, and ran a series of like Friday, Saturday night venues, which were ballroom gigs in the 20s, 30s. This whole shit fight started in 1903 in a family tradition. When I was 14, I thought I'd be the world's greatest drummer. Unfortunately, I was crap, had to pay off a drum kit, and my father made me work on the door of one of his venues to pay him back. So I started running venues and just developed from there. I mean, it was all really fresh and really new, and life was magnificent, and I was young and feisty and bulletproof, and that's how it developed.
Right, so you were at the Q Club in its infamous days. Do you want to tell us about the Q Club?
The Q Club was actually Melbourne's. It was an unlicensed venue and basically had its glory days before 10 o'clock closing started in Melbourne. So it was like every Saturday night you get 2,500 people that wanted to have a good time into an unlicensed venue. And it was fantastic. We were probably the first venue in Australia that gave people drink riders, gave the band some food, had PA towers, you know, put a front of house desk on a riser, stuff like that. Because classic venue then was, it was half a dozen lights in the roof, a column of 8-inch speakers, probably 8 or 10 in a column each side, you know, a couple of microphones, and let's go. Because it was a real transition point for hardware, for everything else that you were using. I mean, jams were just starting. It was quite an interesting period.
So where was the Q Club? When was that, and who were some of the bands who played there?
The Q Club ran from about 68, 66 to 72. It was in the Q Civic Centre in Melbourne, in Cotham Road. And the bands, some of the bands, John Mayall and the Blues Breakers played there. Sherbet played there. Lobby Lloyd played there. Billy Thorpe, who turned my head around as an 18-year-old and just made me realise what rock and roll was all about, and just blew me away, basically. Thorpe, he knocked me over. He was consistently there. A lot of bands, Healing Force, Carson, you know, name anybody that played in Australia in the 70s, and they were there.
So you want to tell us about the gig where Billy Thorpe turned your head around?
I was just standing side stage one night, sort of had a couple of, I don't know if we're allowed to...
You can talk about anything.
I had a couple of spliffs and had a couple of drinks and thought he'd just broke into, most people I know think that I'm crazy, and I just went, wow. And then he did another song about cigarettes and whiskey and wild, wild women, and I thought, that's the lifestyle I've got to go for, you know, it sounds good to me. Because he was looking good, he was making money out of it, and so was I, and it was just perfect, you know, so it was great.
You've, I guess, become legendary as one of the legendary roadies tour managers in Australia. How did you get into that side of things?
It was strange because I was young and enthusiastic and knew no bounds. I basically bankrupted the business. And Sherbet, who had worked at the venue a few times, did a show at the Dallas Brooks Hall, and Roger Davies asked me to go on the road as a tour manager. Tour manager being, nobody knew what one did. It was basically going out and babysitting the band and making sure the cash came in and just looking after them. And because I had a little security business at the time, he probably thought I could take care of them as well, you know. So that's how that developed. That's how my period of being on the road started, which is 73, 74.
So what was that like, touring with Sherbet with thousands of screaming girls chasing them?
It was really bizarre. I mean, because it was still the formative years in the industry, we did shows. We did one at Victoria Park on the roof of the swimming pool here in Sydney, and had 76,000 people. It was 2SM presents a free show on a Sunday, 76,000 kids out the front. And I just remember those days, and I looked down and there was a crash barrier there, but the crash barrier was made out of scaffolding planks and bits of steel, and you know, it was really strange days. But they were great days.
So are there any particular anecdotes that stand out about the Sherbet tours?
Yeah, we actually had a couple of moments of madness. I mean, everybody was into different substances and, you know, abuses and whatever. We had a situation in Mount Isa, which then was, I mean, you go to a country town and the local hoons would drive around in the utes firing shotguns in the air to tell you to piss off out of town. You're only here to root my sister, you know, I'll give you a slap. It was all that sort of vibe. And the bass player, Tony Mitchell, he was going to remain nameless but bugger him, took a couple of rohypnols, and we had guns on the road and we had hunting bows and arrows, and I walked into his room to quieten him down because he'd just thrown all the jugs out and they called the police and he was throwing furniture at the police car. And he actually pulled this pig hunting bow back on me and said, "Don't touch me, I'm going to kill you." I said, "Well, you better put it through my heart, sunshine, you know, because if you miss me, I'm going to do you, you know, settle down." Because we had the local Mount Isa police force, which was like, I think, 4 guys. And the same night, the front of house guy took the brand new LTD out that Avis had brought in from Brisbane for us. And he said, "Can I borrow the car to go kangaroo hunting?" And I went, "Yeah, not a problem." So the car came back about 6 hours later, covered in blood and fur. Unfortunately, he forgot to tell me he didn't have a gun, you know. So the Avis still went down the shitter at the same time, you know. We got run out of town. It was fantastic. You know. You had to really think on your feet. Interesting days.
So, in the 70s, after Sherbet, what other acts did you tour with?
I did Ted Mullery. I basically looked after a guy called Rockwell T. James, Ronnie Peel. Did John Paul Young here and around the world, and we did some South African shows which were amazing. JPY was huge over there, and we were the first band to actually go to South Africa and demand to have multiracial audiences, which really pissed off the authorities there. They hated us for it. But because he was so popular, they couldn't touch us because the media would have just slammed him.
And any particular stories of JPY in South Africa?
General moments of madness. I mean, the Avengers were really big at the time, and I remember being in Cape Town, and I used to break out in sort of 8 or 10 different characters due to my schizophrenia and, you know, just being a little bit bizarre. And I busted their press conference as Colonel Ramsay Roffington Smythe wearing a pith helmet, and I had a marmoset on my shoulder and just took over the whole room and wrecked it, you know. They were hating me. It was great. Took the piss, basically.
Right. Back in the, just jumping back to the late 60s or early 70s again, you knew Michael Gudinski in the early days when
yeah, we were actually opposition promoters when we were kids. It was really interesting. And as I developed the dance situation and moved into other areas, I watched him open his first part of Mushroom, which was in a little house, and watched the agency formulate, which is now the Harbour Premier Organisation, and just all of that. You know, it was interesting to remember that it was one desk and a pile of posters, and Matt Lake was the first act, who were good mates of mine.
And what was Michael like as a young promoter?
Young, feisty Jewish boy with plenty of hair in Melbourne, you know. Wanted to succeed, and he has. More power to him.
And I guess after, say, you know, touring round in the 70s, what happened in, I guess, the end of the 70s into the 80s?
End of the 70s into the 80s, I actually hooked up with Dragon, who just started to peak, and went around Australia a few times with them, took them to America, had some magic moments in the States with Dragon. You know, we did some clubs in the south of the States where, you know, the guy sitting in the front row was like 70 years old, and their sister was actually their wife, and she was 14. It was pretty bizarre. And one night Mark Hunter just wasn't getting great response and told the audience, and it was a real tough southern town, like a Texan southern town. And he just said, "John Wayne's a faggot," roots his horse, pulls the saddlebags over its head, you know, and the audience threw all the furniture in that joint on the stage. And I seriously thought we were going to die. I thought they were going to kill us, because like the big suckers in the south of Texas. So the only way to save it was walk out with a towel and just mop his brow and go, "You'll be okay, big guy." And just by that action, the audience actually went, "Oh, somebody's got some bottle here," or, you know, somebody's silly enough to be involved, and stopped. And then the band played another couple of songs. They got great response. We got in the car and got out of town, you know.
Were you with bands when they went and played on Countdown and things like that?
Yeah, quite a lot. And I remember sort of we had, when JPY had some situations with Molly where they were going to punch on and stuff like that, and I just said to John, "You don't get paid to fight him, you know. I mean, I'll go in and give him a slap if you like." And it was like everything was settled, you know. But it was just egos and pressure, because it was a very intense time of your life. I mean, the hours we put in, the workload, the strain, etc. I mean, you could snap at any minute. It was and it was noticeable in everybody else as well. I mean, there were long days and a lot of hard work. Nobody was a specialist really in those days. I mean, you turned up, the truck was there, you unloaded it, you set the gear up, you did the show, you pulled it down, you got rid of the act, took them home, put them to bed, got the gear out, and maybe drove all night, you know, and did it again the next day. Gee, I'm glad that's changed, you know. Early 80s, for a couple of years, I managed a guy called Broderick Smith in Melbourne, and he had a band called Big Combo, and we just constantly toured. He was the highest paid unrecorded act in Australia at the time, which was great, you know. But that dissolved like everything else does, either through being burnt out, greed or insecurity. On the other side of that coin, the Bad Seeds on their night, a very, very scary band. The shiver up the back, just go, how can anybody play like this? How can anybody be that good? And that's frightening when bands go off like that. I mean, the Cruel Sea do it to me now. That's why I'm involved with them. They have nights where you just go, fantastic, it's all worth it, you know.
So how is touring a band in the 90s different to how it was in the 80s or the 70s?
For me,
Yeah.
how is it different for me? Okay, I can put a tour together that goes out for 3 months. I personally can risk the whole amount of money on that tour. It's all in my name under my company. So I could have $300,000 on the line. If the band fell over day 2 and everybody wanted to be paid for promotion and airfares and accommodation and all of those bills, it's my baby. So basically now, due to having a little bit of experience and being really old, I get to set things up. And so I just try and formulate a tour that's as easy as possible, get the best response, take it to the best venues for the people to go to, you know. I mean, I hate to go to venues where the goose on the door goes, oh, you can't come in, mate, you've got shorts on, you know. Fuck off, it's rock and roll, you know what I mean? We don't want to play to suits anyway, so you don't go to those places. But it's 16 to 18 to 20 hours a day. That when you're out on the road, you work. You worry about money, you worry about people's welfare, you worry about their families, you worry how the gigs are going to go. You know, you just keep doing it. And maybe one day you get it right. It's like watering a garden. If you keep watering it enough, it'll grow.
From other people we've spoken to, there seemed to be more violence at gigs in the 60s than there is today.
Yeah, I think there was, but you had a social phenomenon. In part of that period, you had skinheads and sharpies, and you had basically gangs of people that hated one another because that was their social structure. If you came from the western suburbs, you were a skinhead or a sharpie. If you came from the eastern suburbs, you're a jazz or a mod or whatever. And you dressed differently, you looked different, and when you got together, there was a clash, you know.
Did you notice, I guess, at different times, differences between the music culture in the different cities like Sydney and Melbourne?
Yeah, it's been very interesting, Australia, over the years. I always took a theory that if you could cut it in Newcastle and Adelaide, you were a great rock and roll band. Because Adelaide traditionally brought, you know, bands like Chisel, and Newcastle, you know, has had bands like the Jets and whatever. And because they are more working class oriented towns and people go out for a harder time, like they want to really be entertained because their money's been harder for them to get, and they probably drink a bit harder. And the bands that actually cut it there, I figure, are world class. And that was not so much now, but a few years ago, to me that was the proving ground.
So in the late 60s, what was the kind of difference between Sydney and Melbourne and the scenes and the audiences there?
Sydney was your hip surf crowd, you know, by nature, Surf City and the other venues that were here, and it was a lot of beachside venues. Melbourne was more your inner city things. I'm in the early days of Birdies and Sebastians with bands like Procession and whatever, with Mick Rogers singing and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Melbourne was more an English vibe, where Sydney was more your, I suppose, West Coast American vibe. Other side, you know, your surf side.
Okay, that's about it for my questions, but any other thing you'd always wanted to have included in the history of Australian rock and roll, here's the chance.
Okay, history of Australian rock and roll: never work for a wanker, always do what you believe in and work for people you like, and always work with music you like, because when you listen to it 30 times a month, 6 months of the year, if it's crap, you're going to get sick of it and you'll get sick of your gig. End of story. That's the guts, according to the bald guy.